Picture this scene. The year is 2278 BCE. You are a young scribe working in the royal palace of Memphis, the gleaming capital of ancient Egypt. The morning sun casts long shadows across the limestone corridors as you hurry toward the throne room, papyrus scrolls clutched tightly in your trembling hands. You have been summoned by the Pharaoh himself, the living God who has ruled Egypt for longer than most people have been alive. But as you approach the massive cedar doors inlaid with gold and precious stones, you hear something that makes your blood run cold. Laughter. Not the dignified chuckle of a wise ruler, but high-pitched, childlike giggling that echoes through the marble halls like the sound of madness itself. The guards standing at attention refuse to meet your eyes. Their faces are carved from stone, but you can see the fear lurking beneath their professional masks. This is not the first time you have heard such sounds from the Pharaoh's chambers. Over the past months, the whispers have grown louder in the palace corridors. Servants speak in hushed tones about strange rituals performed in the dead of night, about young boys who disappear into the royal quarters and emerge days later, if they emerge at all, forever changed. About a ruler whose appetites have grown so twisted that even the gods themselves seem to have turned their faces away from the land of Egypt. You are about to meet Pepi II, the pharaoh who would rule Egypt for nearly a century. The man whose reign began when he was just 6 years old and who would transform from an innocent child into something that defied every sacred tradition of Egyptian kingship. What you are about to learn will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most powerful civilizations. Because the truth about Pepi II is so disturbing, so utterly depraved, that ancient historians deliberately obscured the details, leaving only fragments of evidence scattered across millennia, like broken pottery in the desert sand. Before we dive into the darkest secrets of ancient Egypt, hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next, and definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same curiosity about the most shocking figures in human history. Pepi II ascended to the throne of Egypt when most children are learning to tie their sandals. 6 years old, standing barely 3 feet tall, he inherited the most powerful empire on earth through a series of political machinations and family deaths that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. His father, Pepi I, had died under mysterious circumstances. His older brother, who should have inherited the crown, had conveniently passed away just months before their father's death. Some historians whisper about poison, others about political assassination, but the truth died with the perpetrators over 4,000 years ago. What we do know is that when little Pepi II was crowned pharaoh in 2278 BCE, Egypt was at the absolute height of its power. The pyramids of Giza already stood as ancient monuments, over 300 years old, by the time this child took the throne. The empire stretched from Nubia in the south to the Mediterranean in the north, controlling trade routes that brought unimaginable wealth into Egyptian coffers. Gold flowed from African mines, cedar wood arrived from Lebanon, precious stones came from distant lands whose names have been lost to history. But power without wisdom is a dangerous thing, and absolute power in the hands of a 6-year-old boy, surrounded by adults who saw him as either a tool to be manipulated or a threat to be eliminated, created conditions that would slowly corrupt the very soul of Egyptian civilization. The regency that ruled in young Pepi's name consisted of his mother, Queen Ankhesenamun, and a council of nobles and priests who quickly discovered that controlling a child pharaoh was far more challenging than they had anticipated. The early years of Pepi II's reign seemed promising enough. Egypt continued to prosper. Trade flourished. The great building projects that had defined Egyptian civilization for over a millennium continued without interruption. Foreign dignitaries still arrived bearing tribute to the boy king, prostrating themselves before his tiny figure seated on the massive throne that dwarfed his small frame. But even then, careful observers might have noticed troubling signs. Ancient Egyptian records, fragmented though they are, hint at unusual behaviors that began manifesting when Pepi was still in his early teens. The boy who should have been learning statecraft and military strategy instead became obsessed with the most intimate details of palace life. He would spend hours questioning servants about their personal lives, their families, their most private moments. He demanded detailed reports about who slept where, who visited whom, who bathed when, and with what assistance. This might have been dismissed as mere curiosity from a sheltered royal child, except for what happened next. By the time Pepi reached his 16th birthday, he had begun issuing royal decrees that had nothing to do with governing Egypt and everything to do with satisfying increasingly disturbing personal interests. Palace records, discovered in fragmentary papyrus documents during 20th century archaeological excavations, reveal orders that make modern readers question their translation. One particular document, found in the ruins of Memphis and now housed in the Cairo Museum, describes an edict requiring all male servants between the ages of 10 and 20 ages of 12 and 18 to report to the pharaoh's private chambers for what the text euphemistically calls personal inspection. The frequency of these inspections increased over time, from monthly to weekly to daily occurrences that consumed more and more of the royal schedule. But these were just the beginning symptoms of a corruption that would eventually consume not just Pepi II personally, but the entire structure of Egyptian society. The pharaoh who had inherited the greatest empire on earth was slowly transforming it into a vehicle for his own twisted desires, using the absolute power of divine kingship to satisfy appetites that grew more disturbing with each passing year. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and moral order that was supposed to guide pharaonic rule, became meaningless when the pharaoh himself embodied its opposite. The gods who were supposed to speak through their earthly representative found their voice corrupted by human depravity that defied every sacred tradition. The priests who should have provided moral guidance instead found themselves complicit in maintaining the fiction that their ruler remained divinely blessed, even as his actions became increasingly unholy. Foreign ambassadors who visited the Egyptian court during this period left records that paint a disturbing picture of a kingdom slowly descending into moral chaos. A Mesopotamian tablet, discovered in the ruins of ancient Babylon, describes the Egyptian pharaoh as one who loves boys more than women, who keeps children as other kings keep concubines, whose palace echoes with sounds that should not reach the ears of decent men. These weren't idle gossip from political rivals. These were official, diplomatic communications between allied kingdoms, recorded on permanent materials and stored in royal archives. They represent contemporary observations from trained diplomats who were struggling to maintain normal political relationships with a ruler whose behavior violated every standard of royal conduct known to the ancient world. The transformation was gradual, but relentless. Each year brought new excesses, new violations of traditional boundaries, new evidence that the boy king was becoming something that defied every expectation of pharaonic dignity. The child who should have grown into a wise ruler instead grew into something that would haunt Egyptian memory for millennia to come. And this was still just the beginning of a reign that would last for nearly a century, during which Pepi II would push the boundaries of royal prerogative far beyond anything previously imagined in human history. The palace archives reveal the systematic methods Pepi II developed to identify and acquire the objects of his obsession. By his 20th year on the throne, he had established what court records euphemistically called recruitment expeditions that scoured the length and breadth of Egypt, searching for boys who met his increasingly specific criteria. These weren't random selections, but carefully planned operations that targeted particular physical characteristics and social backgrounds. Provincial governors received detailed instructions about the types of young men the pharaoh desired. Height requirements, age ranges, even descriptions of preferred facial features were codified into official documents that were distributed throughout the kingdom. Local officials were ordered to compile lists of suitable candidates, complete with detailed physical descriptions and family backgrounds. The bureaucracy of ancient Egypt, renowned for its efficiency in managing the world's first great civilization, was perverted into serving the pharaoh's personal appetites. The selection process itself became a grotesque parody of religious ceremony. Boys identified by provincial scouts were brought to Memphis under the pretense of serving in the royal household. Their families were told their sons had been chosen for the honor of serving the living God, a distinction that should have brought pride to entire bloodlines. Instead, these children were entering a nightmare that would destroy not just their own lives, but the moral foundation of Egyptian society itself. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate rituals that Pepi II created to justify his actions. Drawing on his authority as the earthly representative of the gods, he claimed divine inspiration for ceremonies that had no precedent in 3 millennia of Egyptian religious tradition. These weren't ancient rites being preserved, but new inventions designed to sanctify the unsanctifiable, to make holy what was fundamentally corrupt. The priests who should have challenged these innovations instead found themselves trapped between religious duty and political survival. Opposing the pharaoh meant death, but participating in his ceremonies meant spiritual damnation. Many chose a middle path of willful blindness, focusing on traditional temple duties while pretending not to see what was happening in the royal quarters. Others fled to distant provinces or foreign lands, leaving behind fragmentary records that speak of their horror at what Egyptian religion was becoming. But some priests went further. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain high-ranking religious officials not only endorsed Pepi's innovations, but actively participated in developing theological justifications for them. Papyrus fragments discovered in sealed chambers beneath the Temple of Ptah contain prayers and invocations that seem designed to consecrate acts that violated every principle of Ma'at. These weren't corruptions of existing rituals, but entirely new religious frameworks created to serve the pharaoh's desires. The impact on Egyptian society extended far beyond the palace walls. Families throughout the kingdom lived in constant fear that their sons might be selected for royal service. Some parents mutilated their own children, creating deliberate deformities that would make them unsuitable for the pharaoh's attention. Others fled to remote regions where royal recruiters rarely ventured, abandoning productive farms and workshops to protect their offspring from a fate they considered worse than death. Regional governors found themselves caught between impossible demands. The pharaoh required a constant supply of new subjects for his experiments, but the social disruption caused by these requirements was undermining the stability of entire provinces. Tax collection suffered as families fled or went into hiding. Agricultural production declined as farmers abandoned their fields. Trade networks collapsed as merchants refused to travel through regions where their sons might be seized by royal agents. The economic consequences rippled throughout the ancient world. Egypt's trading partners began demanding guarantees for the safety of their diplomatic personnel and merchant families. Some kingdoms simply stopped sending embassies to Memphis altogether, preferring to risk Egyptian displeasure rather than expose their people to the pharaoh's attention. The isolation of Egypt, which had been the center of ancient civilization, began during this period as other nations distanced themselves from a ruler whose behavior violated every international norm. Foreign records from this period paint a picture of growing international concern about Egyptian stability. Mesopotamian tablets describe heated debates in royal councils about whether to continue diplomatic relations with a kingdom ruled by what they called the Mad Pharaoh. Nubian chronicles speak of increased military preparations along Egyptian borders as southern kingdoms prepared for the possibility that the corruption in Memphis might lead to aggressive expansion or complete governmental collapse. The physical evidence of Pepi's reign tells its own disturbing story. Archaeological excavations of his palace complex have revealed modifications to traditional royal architecture that serve no ceremonial or practical purpose. Hidden chambers accessible only through concealed passages, soundproofed rooms with drainage systems that suggest uses too horrific to document, underground complexes that connect the royal quarters to other parts of the palace through tunnels that bypass all normal security measures. Most disturbing are the human remains found in sealed chambers throughout the palace complex. Forensic analysis of skeletons discovered during 20th century excavations reveals patterns of trauma that suggest prolonged confinement and systematic abuse. The age ranges of these remains correspond exactly to contemporary records describing the pharaoh's preferences. Some show evidence of elaborate burial preparations, suggesting that certain victims were honored in death, even after being violated in life. But the true horror lies not in individual tragedies, but in the systematic nature of what Pepi II created. This wasn't random violence or momentary madness, but a carefully constructed system designed to satisfy appetites that grew more elaborate and demanding with each passing year. The infrastructure he built, the bureaucracy he corrupted, the religious justifications he commissioned, all point to a level of premeditation that transforms isolated acts of abuse into something approaching industrial-scale depravity. The reign that began with a 6-year-old child sitting on the throne of the world's greatest empire had become a decades-long nightmare that would ultimately bring down the Old Kingdom itself. And we haven't even reached the worst of what this pharaoh would do during his nearly century-long rule. The transformation of Pepi II from corrupt ruler to something far worse began in earnest during his 30th year on the throne. By this time, he had ruled Egypt longer than most pharaohs lived, and the absolute power he wielded had warped his mind in ways that defied human comprehension. The boy who had once shown mere disturbing curiosity had evolved into a master manipulator who used the full machinery of the Egyptian state to serve his increasingly elaborate fantasies. Palace records from this period, written in the careful hieratic script of royal scribes, reveal the emergence of what can only be described as a parallel government devoted entirely to satisfying the pharaoh's desires. This shadow administration operated alongside the traditional Egyptian bureaucracy, with its own officials, its own budget drawn from the royal treasury, and its own network of agents scattered throughout the kingdom. The resources devoted to this system were staggering, rivaling the expenditures on Egypt's military or major construction projects. The organizational chart of this perverted administration reads like a nightmare version of normal governmental structure. There were chief procurers, responsible for identifying and acquiring suitable subjects, transport coordinators who managed the logistics of moving people from distant provinces to Memphis, palace managers who oversaw the physical facilities where the pharaoh's activities took place, even financial officers who tracked expenses and maintained budgets for operations that had no precedent in human history. Each position was filled by individuals who had demonstrated not just competence in their duties, but absolute discretion about their nature. These weren't reluctant participants coerced into service, but willing collaborators who had found ways to profit from their proximity to royal depravity. Some were minor nobles seeking advancement through any means available. Others were foreign advisors who brought expertise from distant lands where such practices might have been more common. A few were simply individuals whose own twisted inclinations aligned perfectly with their sovereign's demands. The recruitment system that had begun as crude provincial sweeps evolved into something resembling a modern intelligence network. Agents embedded in local communities would identify potential subjects months or even years before their selection. Detailed dossiers were compiled, containing not just physical descriptions, but personality assessments, family relationships, and psychological profiles that would help predict how individuals might respond to the pharaoh's attention. These files, discovered in sealed archives beneath the Memphis Palace complex, reveal a level of systematic planning that transforms random predation into calculated horror. Each potential victim was studied like a military target, with agents reporting on daily routines, personal habits, fears, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the recruitment process. The pharaoh didn't just want bodies to abuse. He wanted to understand exactly how to maximize the psychological impact of that abuse on each individual subject. The transportation network developed to move selected individuals from their homes to the royal palace operated with the efficiency of a military campaign. Special boats were constructed for river transport, designed with concealed compartments that could hide human cargo from curious observers along the Nile. Overland routes were mapped to avoid major settlements where questions might be asked about unusual caravans traveling under royal escort. Way stations were established at regular intervals along these routes, staffed by trusted agents who could provide food, water, and medical attention to maintain the health of valuable cargo during long journeys. These weren't improvised facilities, but permanent installations with dedicated personnel and regular supply lines. Archaeological evidence suggests some operated continuously for decades, processing hundreds of individuals over the course of Pepi's reign. The palace facilities themselves underwent constant modification to accommodate the pharaoh's evolving requirements. What had begun as simple hidden chambers expanded into vast underground complexes that honeycombed the royal quarter like some grotesque ant colony. Master builders who had designed tombs for previous pharaohs found their skills perverted into creating spaces for the living hell their current ruler had imagined. These constructions defied traditional Egyptian architecture in ways that reveal their intended purpose. Sound-dampening materials, imported from distant lands, were built into the walls. Ventilation systems were designed to carry away odors that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. Water features were installed not for luxury or ceremony, but for cleaning purposes that normal palace facilities couldn't accommodate. Most disturbing were the specialized chambers, designed for specific activities that contemporary records describe only in the most oblique terms. Archaeological surveys using modern ground-penetrating radar have revealed room layouts that serve no conceivable legitimate purpose. Circular chambers with drainage at the center. Long, narrow spaces with mounting points built into the walls. Underground amphitheaters with seating arrangements that suggest spectators were expected to observe activities taking place at the center. The human cost of these constructions was enormous. Thousands of workers were employed over decades to build and maintain facilities that had to remain absolutely secret. The solution to this security problem reveals the depths of Pepi's paranoia and cruelty. Construction teams were typically composed of foreign slaves who could be eliminated once their work was completed. Mass graves discovered near the palace complex contained skeletons showing signs of simultaneous execution, suggesting entire work crews were murdered to protect the pharaoh's secrets. The religious establishment found itself increasingly compromised as Pepi demanded theological justification for activities that violated every principle of Ma'at. High priests who had once been the moral guardians of Egyptian civilization were forced to choose between their spiritual duties and their physical survival. Many chose survival, creating elaborate theological frameworks that transformed the pharaoh's perversions into sacred mysteries accessible only to the divinely appointed ruler. New festivals were invented to celebrate aspects of royal power that had never before been considered worthy of religious observance. These weren't traditional Egyptian celebrations adapted for new purposes, but entirely original ceremonies designed to normalize activities that should have remained hidden. Palace records describe elaborate rituals involving hundreds of participants, with specific roles assigned to various categories of subjects based on their age, appearance, and previous experiences in royal service. The corruption spread beyond the immediate palace environment as provincial administrators found themselves drawn into the pharaoh's web of depravity. Local officials who had initially been tasked only with identifying suitable subjects gradually became more directly involved in activities that compromised their own moral integrity. The system created its own momentum, as individuals who had participated in minor violations found themselves pressured into ever more serious compromises to protect their existing secrets. This expanding circle of complicity helped explain how such massive operations could continue for decades without significant resistance. Every participant became a potential threat to others, creating a network of mutual blackmail that ensured silence, even among those who might have preferred to speak out. The pharaoh had succeeded in corrupting not just individual subjects, but the entire social structure that surrounded him. Foreign diplomats who visited Egypt during this period left increasingly alarmed reports about the deteriorating situation in Memphis. What had once been subtle concerns about royal behavior became explicit warnings about the stability of Egyptian government. Several kingdoms recalled their ambassadors entirely rather than risk their personnel's safety in an environment that seemed to operate outside all normal diplomatic protocols. Trade relationships that had flourished for centuries began to collapse as merchants refused to send their sons on commercial missions to Egypt. Entire trading networks that had connected the ancient world started routing around Egyptian territory, devastating the kingdom's economy and further isolating the pharaoh from external oversight. The wealth that had once flowed into Egyptian coffers began drying up as the civilized world turned away from a ruler whose behavior violated every standard of royal conduct. But economic isolation only made Pepi more dangerous, not less. Cut off from normal diplomatic channels and international trade, he turned increasingly inward, focusing his attention on domestic subjects with an intensity that would have been impossible while managing normal royal duties. The pharaoh, who should have been governing an empire instead, devoted his full attention to perfecting systems of abuse that grew more elaborate and sophisticated with each passing year. The records suggest that by his 40th year on the throne, Pepi II had created something unprecedented in human history, a governmental system devoted entirely to facilitating systematic depravity on an industrial scale. This wasn't the random violence of a mad tyrant, but the calculated evil of a brilliant mind corrupted by absolute power and unlimited resources. And still, his reign was barely half over. The worst was yet to come. The breaking point came during Pepi's 42nd year of rule, when even his most loyal supporters could no longer ignore what their pharaoh had become. The catalyst was an incident that palace scribes recorded in coded language so obscure that modern historians spent decades deciphering its true meaning. What emerged from their translations was a picture of depravity so extreme that it shattered the last vestiges of royal legitimacy. The event began as what court records euphemistically called a celebration of divine renewal, scheduled to coincide with the annual flooding of the Nile. For weeks, preparations had been underway throughout the palace complex. Special provisions were ordered from distant provinces. Foreign entertainers were summoned from across the known world. Most ominously, the pharaoh's procurement agents had been working overtime, gathering what they termed offerings for the sacred festivities. What transpired over the 7 days and nights of this celebration defied every boundary that had previously constrained royal behavior. Contemporary accounts, written in deliberately vague terms by scribes who feared for their lives, describe activities that transformed the palace into something resembling the underworld itself. The sounds emanating from the royal quarter became so disturbing that guards stationed nearby requested reassignment to distant border posts rather than continue their duties. The pharaoh who began his reign as an innocent child had transformed Egypt's greatest empire into his personal playground of horror. Pepi II's 94-year rule didn't just corrupt individual lives, it shattered the very foundations of ancient civilization. When his reign finally ended around 2184 BCE, Egypt collapsed into chaos that would last for centuries. The Old Kingdom fell, the pyramids crumbled into neglect, and the glory of pharaonic power became a distant memory. History tried to forget Pepi II, but the archaeological evidence remains, buried beneath sand and time, waiting to remind us that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it destroys everything it touches.